The Whitaker plantation lay where the river bent and slowed, where cypress trees stood with their roots half submerged, and the air always carried the damp taste of mud and sweet cane. Even in the early morning, heat pressed down like a hand, and the world felt older than it looked, older than the painted fences, older than the big house with its white columns, older than the polished brass bell that called the household to order. Mary learned quickly that this place did not run on sunlight or seasons. It ran on rules. She had been brought to Cypress Road when she was 16, small enough to be overlooked, quiet enough to be trusted, and, unfortunately for her, beautiful enough to be remembered. Beauty was not a blessing in a house that measured people like property. Beauty was a spark. And here, sparks were either snuffed out or turned into fire. By 19, Mary moved through the big house as if she had been born in its hallways. She knew the creak of every stair, the smell of every room, the way the light fell differently in the parlor at noon than it did in the evening. She knew how to pour tea without making a sound, how to fold linen so tight it looked carved, how to keep her eyes lowered even when her thoughts were loud. The other house servants spoke to her in fragments, warnings that never formed full sentences. Don't linger, old Jonah would mutter when he passed her carrying wood for the kitchen stove. Don't answer too quick, the cook, Miss Della, would tell her, stirring a pot as if stirring advice into the air. And don't ever, whispered Ruth, who scrubbed the floors until her hands were raw, don't ever forget who watches. Mary understood who watched. Eleanor Whitaker watched. The mistress of the house was not old, not truly, but she wore her youth like a tight corset, pulled so hard it turned every breath into a complaint. Eleanor's hair was always pinned neatly, her dresses always pale and expensive, her smile always arranged as if she practiced it in a mirror. From a distance she looked delicate, almost harmless. Up close she was sharp. Her eyes were the color of watered-down tea, and they never rested. She had a way of looking at Mary that made Mary feel like a candle placed too near a curtain. Not desire. Not admiration. Something colder. Something that counted. Possession threatened. Mary had learned to live inside that gaze. To shrink beneath it without appearing to shrink. To be present but not noticeable. Useful but not memorable. But the mistress' attention was not a thing Mary could control. It was a storm that arrived when it wanted. And then there was Nathaniel Whitaker. He was the master of the plantation, young enough that people still called him Sir with a particular kind of hope, as if youth might mean softness. He was tall, well-dressed, handsome in a tired way, as if sleep never truly found him. When he walked through the house, the air changed slightly. People moved faster. Voices softened. Chairs scraped less. It wasn't love that made them careful. It was his authority, quiet and unquestioned. Nathaniel spoke politely. He held doors. He said thank you sometimes, even to those who were not supposed to receive gratitude. He had the kind of manners that could fool an outsider into thinking the man was gentle. Mary had once believed gentleness mattered. It began, for her, with a book. It happened on an afternoon so ordinary that she wouldn't have remembered it at all, if not for what it became. She had been dusting the shelves in Nathaniel's study, an airy room lined with volumes he rarely opened. The windows were cracked to let in a breeze that never fully arrived. Nathaniel stood by the desk, sorting papers, looking distracted and tense. Mary reached up for a high shelf, and a thin book slipped forward. She caught it before it fell. It was worn at the corners, its leather cover soft from use. Nathaniel glanced up. His eyes landed on the book in her hands, and something flickered across his face, surprise, then hesitation. You can keep that for the evening, he said quietly, as if the walls might hear. Mary froze. Sir. It's poetry, he added. Just return it tomorrow. Mary's heart kicked hard in her chest. She lowered her gaze. Yes, sir. He went back to his papers as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't placed something dangerous in her hands. Mary carried the book away like contraband, feeling the weight of it not in ounces but in consequence. That night, in her small attic space under the roof, she opened it by candlelight. The words were difficult for her, but she could read enough to feel their shape. Lines about longing, about distance, about a world that existed beyond fences and ownership. She traced the letters with her finger until her eyes blurred. She hid the book beneath a loose floorboard when she heard footsteps on the stairs. The next day, she returned it exactly as he asked. No more. No less. But the seed had been planted. Not because a book could change the rules of a house, but because the act had made Mary feel seen, not as an object, not as a tool, but as a person capable of receiving something meant for the mind. It was a dangerous feeling. Mary tried to bury it. She tried to let it die quietly. She told herself that Nathaniel's kindness was a mask, that his manners meant nothing, that her feelings were foolish. Yet over the weeks, there were more moments. A glass of water placed near her as she worked late in the dining room. A simple question, "Are you well?" spoken in a voice that wasn't meant to command. A brief pause when Eleanor's sharp words cut the air, as if Nathaniel had heard the cruelty and wished he hadn't. Mary never answered more than she should. She never let her gaze rise too long. She never allowed her hands to brush his. But she felt him. The way he moved through rooms with a shadow of sadness. The way he avoided conflict with his wife by stepping away rather than stopping her. The way he looked at Mary sometimes, only sometimes, with an expression that was not desire, not hunger, but something like regret. Regret was not love. Regret did not protect anyone. Still, Mary's heart did not obey logic. It obeyed hope. And hope, on Cypress Road, was a thing that could get you killed. Eleanor's attention sharpened as Mary's hope grew. It began with small humiliations, delivered with a smile. Eleanor would ask Mary to bring tea, then criticize the temperature as if Mary had personally offended her. She would request a particular ribbon for her hair and then accuse Mary of misplacing it, only to find it later in a drawer Mary had already emptied. She would ask Mary to polish the silver until it shone, then hold it up to the light and claim she saw fingerprints that weren't there. Sometimes Eleanor's cruelty was quiet. Sometimes it was a performance. Once, at a small gathering, Eleanor called Mary into the parlor and, with guests present, asked her to recite a prayer. Mary's voice shook as she spoke the words she had memorized as a child. Eleanor listened with a thoughtful expression, then remarked lightly, "How charming. She almost sounds educated." Laughter rippled among the guests, thin, polite, harmless on the surface. Mary felt it land like gravel in her throat. Later, in the kitchen, Miss Della pressed a cloth into Mary's hands. "Breathe," she said, low and firm. "Don't let it show." Mary nodded. Her palms were damp. Her shoulders ached from holding herself still. That night, she found something beneath her pillow. A needle. It was small and ordinary, the kind used for sewing. But it lay there like a message. Like a warning. Like proof that someone had been in her space. Mary held it between two fingers, staring at the glint of metal. She felt the skin along her arms tighten. She did not accuse anyone. Accusation was a privilege. Instead, she slid the needle into the seam of her mattress and slept facing the door. A week later, Eleanor summoned her upstairs, to the sitting room where the curtains stayed drawn and the furniture was too pristine to feel lived in. Eleanor stood by the window, looking out as if she owned the view itself. Without turning, she said, "Come here." Mary stepped forward and stopped at the proper distance. "Yes, Ma'am." Eleanor's voice was soft. That softness was always a sign of danger. "Do you know what people say about you?" Mary kept her face calm. "No, Ma'am." Eleanor turned then, slowly. Her gaze traveled over Mary as if taking inventory. "They say you have an advantage," she said. "They say you know how to look at a man." Mary's throat tightened. "I do my work, Ma'am." Eleanor smiled. "Of course you do. You always do. You work. You move through my house. You exist in spaces that do not belong to you." Mary said nothing. Silence was the only shield she had. Eleanor stepped closer, close enough that Mary could smell rosewater and powder. Eleanor lifted her gloved hand and placed two fingers under Mary's chin, tilting her face upward. The touch was not gentle. It was ownership. "Listen carefully," Eleanor whispered. "Everything you see here belongs to me. The silver, the curtains, the land, the people, even the air, if I decide it does. And my husband." She paused, smiling with her mouth but not her eyes. "My husband especially." Mary's breathing stayed even by force. "Yes, Ma'am." Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly. "If I ever see you forget that," she murmured, "I will remind you." She released Mary and turned away again, as if the conversation had been about weather. Mary left the room with her spine straight and her stomach hollow. Downstairs, she passed the corner of the hallway where the floorboards changed. There, beneath a faded rug, was a thick wooden door set into the floor, an access door that led to the cellar. Most people avoided stepping near it. Even the dogs, when they wandered close, would stop and turn away as if the door had a smell. Mary had heard the cellar mentioned, never explained. "That's where they keep old barrels," Ruth once said quickly, then refused to say more. "That's where they keep things cold," Jonah had offered, eyes on the ground. "Don't ask," Miss Della had snapped when Mary had tried. Mary had never seen inside. She had only heard sounds at night, soft metallic shifts, as if chains moved in the dark. Once, months ago, she had been carrying laundry past the back of the house when she saw men hauling a large crate toward that corner. The crate was covered with burlap, and it seemed to ripple, just slightly, as if something inside moved. Mary had stared too long. Jonah had appeared and pulled her away by the sleeve. Eyes down, he had hissed. "Not there." Mary's dreams remembered that crate. Her waking mind tried to forget it. Now, after Eleanor's warning, the cellar felt closer than it ever had before, like a shadow that had moved into the room. That evening, the big house gathered for supper. Eleanor sat at the head of the table with her usual poise. Nathaniel sat beside her, quieter than usual, his gaze drifting toward the window as if he wished he could walk through it. Mary served quietly, refilling glasses, changing plates, moving like a ghost. At one point, Nathaniel's hand hovered near the breadbasket, and Mary reached for it at the same time. Their fingers did not touch. They came close enough that Mary felt the heat of his skin in the air. Nathaniel looked up. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. In that instant, Mary thought she saw a question in his face. A question he would never dare speak. Then Eleanor's voice cut across the table. "Mary," she said, bright and sweet, "you're spilling." Mary glanced down. There was no spill. But she lifted her cloth and wiped the table anyway. Eleanor watched her do it, satisfied. After supper, as Mary cleared dishes in the kitchen, she heard voices from the hallway near Nathaniel's study. The door was not fully closed. Sound carried. Eleanor's voice was low, tight. "She looks at you," she said. Nathaniel's voice answered, weary. "She's a servant, Eleanor." "She's a servant," Eleanor repeated, with a laugh that held no humor. "And yet she has the nerve to exist like she has feelings." A pause. Nathaniel said something Mary couldn't hear. Eleanor's voice rose slightly. "If you won't handle it," she said, "then I will." Mary's hands stopped moving. A plate hovered in her grip. She felt the sentence lodge itself in her chest like a stone. "If you won't handle it, then I will." Mary set the plate down carefully, as if sound might betray her. She backed away from the doorway. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might shake the walls. She went up to her attic room and sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. They were young hands, but already marked by work, small cuts, rough palms, a thin scar where soap had burned her skin months ago. She thought of Eleanor's tests. The vase, the needle, the cruel words delivered in public. She thought of the way Eleanor watched her like a threat. And she thought of what handle it might mean in a house where punishment had a door in the floor. Mary pressed her fingertips to her lips, trying to steady her breathing. She told herself she would be careful. She told herself she would become even quieter, even smaller. She told herself she would stop hoping, stop looking at Nathaniel, stop letting her heart imagine impossible things. But as she lay down, the house settling into night around her, she heard that faint metallic sound again, from below, near the cellar door. A slow shift, like something heavy dragging across stone. Mary's eyes opened in the darkness. She stared at the rafters above her bed. She realized then that Eleanor's jealousy was not a passing mood. It was a decision. And in a place like Cypress Road, when a mistress decided you were a problem, the house itself would eventually move to erase you. Mary turned onto her side and pressed her palm to her chest, feeling her heartbeat like a trapped bird. Downstairs, somewhere beneath the floor, something moved in the dark. And Mary understood, with a cold clarity that made her stomach twist, that the real story of her life here was only beginning. Morning on Cypress Road always arrived the same way. With damp heat rising off the ground, with birds calling from the cypress line, with the distant murmur of the river that never seemed to rest. The big house woke slowly, like a creature stretching its bones. Doors opened. Footsteps crossed hallways. The kitchen fire snapped to life. And Mary, already awake, already dressed, already careful, stepped into the rhythm as if she had no choice but to belong to it. After the night of Eleanor's warning, Mary moved with a new kind of attention. She listened harder. She watched longer. She learned to read silence the way she had learned to read a few lines of poetry, slowly, with effort, with fear of misunderstanding. The mistress did not speak of the sitting room conversation again. She didn't need to. Eleanor's threats never vanished, they simply became the air everyone breathed. At breakfast, Eleanor looked serene. She sipped coffee, corrected a servant's posture with a glance, and spoke lightly about the weather as if she had not promised to remind Mary of her place. Nathaniel sat beside her, his shoulders slightly tense, his gaze drifting toward the window as though he could leave by looking hard enough. Mary served quietly, eyes lowered, hands steady. She thought of the needle under her pillow. She thought of the cellar door in the floor. She did not think of hope. She tried not to. Yet the house had a way of forcing her to feel things she did not want. Later that morning, Nathaniel called for Mary in the hallway outside his study. Mary's stomach tightened. She came to a stop a few feet away, hands folded in front of her. "Yes, sir." Nathaniel's eyes flicked toward the staircase, then toward the parlor, as if checking whether Eleanor might appear. His voice was low. "I need the desk cleared," he said. And, he hesitated, then added, "I found something you might like." Mary did not lift her gaze fully, but she saw his hand extend with a thin bundle of paper, an old pamphlet, creased and softened by use. The title was faded. The words were difficult, but she recognized enough to understand it was a collection of hymns and poems, the kind that could be sung or read quietly, the kind that carried hidden meanings for people who had to hide their meanings. Mary's breath caught. "Sir, take it," Nathaniel said quickly, as if he regretted offering and needed it accepted before his courage failed. "Just for the day. Return it before supper." Mary's fingers trembled as she took the bundle. "Thank you, sir." Nathaniel nodded once and turned away, disappearing into the study. He left Mary standing in the hallway with paper in her hands that felt heavier than chains. She told herself not to be foolish. She told herself this was not affection. It was not a promise. It was not even kindness, not really. It was a man's brief desire to feel less guilty, to do one small thing that cost him nothing and buy himself the comfort of believing he was decent. Still, Mary's heart responded the way hearts sometimes do, without permission. In the attic at midday, while the house settled into its quieter hours, Mary opened the bundle and traced the printed lines with her finger. A hymn about deliverance. A poem about rivers. Words that described freedom as if it were a place you could walk to, not an idea you had to bleed for. She read slowly, sounding the syllables in her mind. Each sentence was a doorway to a world she was not meant to enter. Footsteps creaked on the attic stairs. Mary's hand snapped the papers closed. Her breath stopped. The door opened and Ruth appeared, carrying folded cloth. Ruth's eyes widened when she saw the papers. "Mary," she whispered, alarmed. "Don't keep that out." Mary's mouth went dry. "He gave it to me," she whispered back. "Just for today." Ruth's expression shifted, fear and something like pity. "That makes it worse," she murmured. If she finds anything," Mary said quietly, "it's worse." Ruth set the cloth down and leaned closer. "Eleanor's been in a mood," she whispered. "More than usual. She sent Jonah to fix the gate twice just to watch him sweat. She made Miss Della throw out an entire pot of stew because it tasted too strong." Mary swallowed. "Because of me?" Ruth didn't answer directly. She didn't have to. That afternoon, Eleanor found a new way to test Mary's nerves. She called Mary into her bedroom and stood by her dressing table, holding a small glass bottle with no label. "Take this to the kitchen," Eleanor said, her voice sweet. "Tell them to add it to the floor water." The hallways looked dull. Mary stared at the bottle. The liquid inside was clear, harmless looking. "Yes, Ma'am." As Mary turned to leave, Eleanor added lightly, "Be careful. It's strong." Mary carried the bottle downstairs with a cold feeling spreading in her stomach. In the kitchen doorway she paused, scanning the room. Miss Della stood at the stove. Jonah was splitting kindling. Ruth was kneading dough. Nobody spoke, but Jonah's eyes met Mary's for the briefest second. His gaze dropped to the bottle. His face tightened. Mary's fingers closed around the glass. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was meant to harm. Eleanor's strong never meant effective. It meant punishing. Mary moved deeper into the kitchen and placed the bottle near Miss Della without speaking. Miss Della's hand hovered above it. She sniffed, then recoiled slightly. "What is that?" Miss Della muttered, "Low." Mary shook her head once, barely. A warning without words. Miss Della's eyes narrowed. She reached for a ladle and dipped it into the pot on the stove, then, so smoothly it looked like habit, poured a small amount of steaming broth into a chip cup and slid it toward Mary. "Drink," she said quietly, as if it were nothing. "And then go fetch me the salt from the pantry." Mary understood. She lifted the cup to her lips. The broth was hot, salty, ordinary. She sipped slowly while Miss Della picked up Eleanor's bottle and tipped a tiny amount into an empty tin. A faint, sharp smell rose. Miss Della's expression hardened. "Lie," she whispered. Mary's throat tightened. She had felt lie before, on her skin, burning, cracking, making wounds that took weeks to heal. Miss Della glanced toward the hallway to make sure no one was watching. "Well, not put this in the floor water," she murmured. "Not today." Mary's hands trembled slightly around the cup. Miss Della picked up a second bottle, plain water, and, with quick precision, swapped the liquids. She filled Eleanor's bottle with harmless water, then slid the real lye tin deep under the counter. Mary stared at her. "Shall know," Mary whispered. Miss Della's mouth tightened. "Shall know whatever she wants to know," she said. "But shall have less proof." Mary carried the now harmless bottle back upstairs and placed it on Eleanor's dressing table as instructed. Eleanor looked at Mary as she returned. Her eyes were bright, assessing. "Did you do as I said?" "Yes, Ma'am." Eleanor's lips curved. "Good." Mary left the room with her pulse hammering. She understood, with growing certainty, that Eleanor's cruelty was not impulsive. It was systematic. Eleanor was building a case against her, laying traps meant to force Mary into a mistake that could be punished. And Mary could feel the punishment waiting beneath the floor. 2 days later, Eleanor set a sharper trap. It began with a brooch. Eleanor appeared in the parlor with guests, 2 neighboring women and a man who spoke too loudly about horse prices. Eleanor's laughter rang bright. The guests smiled. The atmosphere pretended at normal life. Mary moved among them with a tray, offering tea and small cakes. She kept her eyes lowered. She kept her posture perfect. She did not allow herself to exist too strongly. At some point, Eleanor's voice rose, light and surprised. "Oh," she exclaimed. "My mother's brooch. Where is it?" The guests turned their heads. Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest, performing distress. "It was right here, on my collar." Mary's stomach tightened. She recognized the tone, the innocent sweetness that always came before harm. Eleanor's eyes swept the room, then settled on Mary as if by accident. "Mary," she said gently, "have you seen it?" Mary's mouth went dry. "No, Ma'am." Eleanor's smile remained. "Perhaps it fell," she said. "We should look." The guests murmured sympathetically. One woman offered to help. Eleanor waved her off. "No need," she said. "Mary can look. She has sharp eyes." Mary knelt, scanning the rug, the chair legs, the table edge. She moved carefully, knowing she was being watched from every angle. After a moment, Eleanor made a thoughtful sound. "Mary," she said, "stand up." Mary stood slowly. Eleanor's gaze dropped to Mary's apron pocket. "What is that bulge?" Eleanor asked lightly. Mary's heart slammed against her ribs. She lifted her hands away from her body, showing she held nothing. Eleanor stepped forward and slipped her fingers into Mary's apron pocket. She pulled out the brooch. The room went silent. Mary's vision narrowed. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Eleanor held the brooch up between 2 fingers. "How strange," she murmured, still smiling, still performing. "It was in your pocket." Mary's voice came out thin. I didn't take it, Ma'am." The guests looked away or stared too openly. The man cleared his throat. One woman pressed her lips together as if refusing to react. Eleanor tilted her head. "Are you calling me a liar?" she asked softly. Mary felt sweat gather at her hairline. She kept her gaze lowered. "No, Ma'am. I'm saying I didn't take it." Eleanor's expression hardened for a flicker of a second before the smile returned. "Of course," she said brightly. "Perhaps it fell in there while you were serving. Accidents happen." The guests relaxed slightly. They accepted Eleanor's version because it allowed them to keep their comfort. Eleanor pinned the brooch back onto her collar with a slow, deliberate motion. Then Eleanor leaned closer to Mary, so close her breath warmed Mary's cheek. Her voice dropped low enough that only Mary could hear. "Accidents happen," Eleanor whispered. "Downstairs, too." Mary's blood went cold. Later, when the guests had left, Eleanor's sweetness vanished. She summoned Mary to the hallway near the cellar door, the one set into the floor. The rug had been shifted slightly, exposing a strip of worn wood and iron hinges. Mary stopped a few feet away, her hands clenched inside her apron. Eleanor stood with her arms folded. "Do you know what happens to thieves in this house?" she asked. Mary forced herself to answer evenly. "No, Ma'am." Eleanor's eyes glittered. "They learn," she said. A faint metallic clink rose from beneath the floor, so quiet it might have been imagination. Mary's stomach twisted. Eleanor watched Mary's reaction like a scientist watching an experiment. "You are very pretty," Eleanor said suddenly, almost conversational. "Pretty enough that people start thinking you're special. Pretty enough that you might begin to believe you deserve more than your place." Mary did not speak. Eleanor's voice sharpened. "You will not have my husband's attention. Not his smiles. Not his pity. Not his foolish softness." Mary's throat tightened. She kept her gaze down, but inside her mind something sparked: anger, helplessness, a desperate urge to speak truth. Eleanor took one step closer. "And if you keep drawing his eyes," she whispered, "I will put you somewhere no eyes can find you." Mary's fingers curled into her palm hard enough to hurt. She said nothing. Silence was still her shield. Eleanor turned away with a satisfied exhale, leaving Mary standing near the cellar door with the rug half pulled back like a threat left on display. That night, Mary barely slept. The attic felt smaller than ever. The roof creaked as wind moved through the trees. The house made its settling sounds. And beneath it all, Mary listened for the faint movement under the floor. At some point in the dark hours, she heard footsteps in the hallway below, soft, careful. A door opened. A whisper of cloth. Mary sat up, heart racing. She heard the rug scrape. Then, briefly, the sound of the cellar door's latch shifting. Mary's mouth went dry. She imagined Eleanor standing there in the dark, opening the door just enough to let something breathe, just enough to remind Mary what waited. The latch clicked again. The door shut. Mary lay back down, trembling, and stared at the darkness until morning. The next day, Nathaniel spoke to Mary again, briefly, unexpectedly. It happened in the pantry, a small room that smelled of flour and dried herbs. Mary had been gathering jars when Nathaniel stepped in, closing the door behind him. Mary froze. "Sir." Nathaniel's face looked drawn, as if he had not slept. He did not move closer. He kept a careful distance, like a man who understood boundaries too late. "I heard about the brooch," he said quietly. Mary swallowed. "I didn't take it." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I know," he murmured. Mary's breath caught. She lifted her eyes to his, only for a second. In his gaze she saw something like shame. Mary began, then stopped. Speaking about Eleanor was dangerous in any room, even with the door closed. Nathaniel looked down at his hands. "Eleanor has a temper," he said, as if the word temper could cover cruelty. "Try not to provoke her." Mary felt something inside her go still. "I'm trying to survive her," Mary said before she could stop herself. Silence filled the pantry like smoke. Nathaniel flinched slightly, as if Mary had struck him with truth. He looked at her again, and for the first time his polite mask slipped enough to show fear. "Mary," he said, voice low, "don't do anything reckless." Mary's mouth tightened. "Reckless," she repeated softly. Nathaniel opened his mouth as if to say more, perhaps a warning, perhaps an apology, but footsteps sounded in the hallway outside. He stepped back quickly, smoothing his expression, preparing to be the man he needed to be. Before he opened the pantry door, he whispered one last sentence without looking at her. "She won't stop," he said. Then he left. Mary stood alone in the pantry, surrounded by jars and flour sacks, with that sentence echoing in her head. She won't stop. By late afternoon, Eleanor made her decision clearer. Mary was called upstairs again. Eleanor sat at her dressing table, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes. Her tone was casual. "Mary," she said, "tomorrow you'll accompany me to the orchard after lunch." Mary's heart tightened. "Yes, Ma'am." Eleanor met Mary's gaze in the mirror. Her eyes were bright, satisfied. "I've been thinking," Eleanor said lightly, "about how to handle inconveniences." Mary's blood ran cold. Eleanor's smile widened just slightly. "If Nathaniel won't handle it," she murmured, almost repeating the words Mary had overheard, "then I will." Mary felt the room tilt. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Eleanor stood and stepped close, her perfume sharp. "Be punctual tomorrow," she whispered. "And be obedient. It will go better for you if you cooperate." Mary nodded because her body knew how to survive in the moment. "Yes, Ma'am." She left the room with her knees weak. She walked down the stairs as if her legs belonged to someone else. In the hallway, she passed the cellar corner. The rug lay perfectly in place again, hiding the door beneath. But Mary could feel it there, like a mouth closed over teeth. She understood what tomorrow meant. The orchard was behind the palisade fence, away from the public eyes of the yard. It was private, quiet, a place where accidents could happen, a place where Eleanor could handle Mary. Mary went to the shed behind the kitchen, claiming she needed to fetch twine. Inside, the air smelled of hay, rust, and old tools. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light. She scanned the shelves, pretending calm. Then she saw it. A steel trap. It hung from a nail on the back wall, iron dark and heavy, its jaws closed like a clenched mouth. Men used traps like that for foxes and wolves. Mary had seen one once, and Jonah had warned her never to touch the trigger plate, never to trust at hunger. Mary stepped closer. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She did not want to become cruel. She did not want blood on her hands. She did not want to be a monster shaped by this place. But she also did not want to be dragged into the cellar to die slowly in darkness, swallowed by fear and scales and silence. Mary lifted her hand and wrapped her fingers around the trap's chain. The metal was cold. She held it for a long moment, breathing shallowly, feeling the weight of choice settle into her bones. Tomorrow, Eleanor would take her to the orchard. Tomorrow, Eleanor would handle it. Mary lowered the trap carefully, unhooking it from the nail. She wrapped it in burlap to hide its shape. She lifted it with both hands, straining under the weight. As she carried it out of the shed, the sky above the plantation looked unchanged, blue, indifferent, endless. But inside Mary, something had shifted. She was done waiting to be erased. And now she was planning, quietly, to bite back. Mary chose her moment the way a desperate person chooses a door in a burning house, quickly, quietly, and without the luxury of certainty. Before sunrise, when the yard still held pockets of night and the air was cool enough to pretend it was gentle, she slipped out behind the kitchen with the burlap-wrapped bundle held tight against her ribs. The steel trap was heavier than she had expected. Its weight pulled at her arms and steadied her thoughts at the same time, as if the iron itself insisted on seriousness. She moved along the side of the smokehouse, keeping to shadow, listening for any stir from the quarters or the stable. The plantation was never truly asleep, but it had a softness in those early minutes, the kind of quiet that could make a person believe in miracles. Mary did not believe in miracles. She believed in doors that locked from the outside. The orchard lay behind the palisade fence, past a narrow gate that creaked when it opened. Mary held the latch and guided it slowly, refusing to let it make a sound. She stepped into the orchard and breathed in the scent of damp soil and fruit that had begun to sweeten on the branches. Here, the world looked almost innocent. Pear trees stood in a loose line, their leaves trembling in the faintest breeze. Peach trees curved low with their burden. Bees moved between blossoms as if the place belonged to them alone. If Mary had not known better, she might have thought this was simply a garden. But she did know better. Eleanor had chosen the orchard for a reason. Privacy. Soft ground. Fewer witnesses. A place where accidents could happen and be explained later with a shrug and a story polished for polite ears. Mary walked the familiar path slowly, counting her steps, recalling the way Eleanor strolled after lunch. Eleanor never watched the ground. Eleanor watched the world as if it existed to hold her up. Mary stopped beneath a pear tree where the grass was pressed flatter than elsewhere, worn down by repeated footsteps. This was the curve Eleanor always took, drawn by the low branch heavy with fruit. Mary stared at the ground and felt her mouth go dry. She knelt and unwrapped the burlap. The trap lay inside like a sleeping thing. Mary's fingers hovered above it for a moment. She remembered Jonah's warning, iron teeth, hunger, speed. She remembered Eleanor's voice, sweet and sharp. I will remind you. She remembered the needle under her pillow. She remembered the cellar door and the faint metallic sound beneath it. She exhaled once, controlled, and began. Mary used a stick to move the trap into position, refusing to place her hands where the jaws could bite. She pressed the hinge points into the soil, packed the earth around the base so it would not shift, and adjusted the trigger plate until it lay flat. Her movements were careful, deliberate, almost reverent in their attention, because any mistake would take her fingers and leave her helpless. When she was satisfied, she covered the trap with a thin layer of loose dirt and scattered leaves across it, making the surface look natural. She stepped back and studied her work from a few angles, as if she were a hunter preparing for an animal. Then she stood still, listening. The orchard remained quiet. Only birds. Only bees. Only the distant sound of kitchen work beginning in the yard beyond the fence. Mary wrapped the burlap and tucked it under her arm. She wiped her palms on her skirt, though they were already clean, and forced her breathing to slow. She walked back through the gate and returned to the house as if she had merely been fetching herbs. Inside, the morning rushed in. The clatter of pans, the sharp smell of coffee, the murmur of voices. Mary moved through it with the practiced calm of someone who had learned to hide storms inside her chest. At breakfast, Eleanor appeared as composed as ever. Her hair was pinned perfectly. Her dress was pale and crisp. The bandage on her sole, if it existed, did not show. Nathaniel sat beside her, quieter than usual, and Mary could not help noticing how little he ate. His fork moved without purpose, as if food had become meaningless. He looked toward the window more than once, and each time his gaze returned, it seemed heavier. Mary served and listened. Eleanor spoke lightly about the day. She mentioned a new ribbon she had ordered. She complained about the heat. She smiled when she wanted to, as if smiling were a switch she could flip at will. When she looked at Mary, her eyes held a bright, contained satisfaction. After breakfast, Eleanor's gaze followed Mary through the house in reflections. Mirrors, polished wood, glass. It felt like being watched by something that did not blink. At noon, Mary did her work in the kitchen with hands that seemed steady even to her. Miss Della gave her a look that asked a question she did not dare speak. Ruth avoided Mary's eyes entirely, as if eye contact might make a curse real. Jonah passed by once and paused long enough to murmur, "Keep your head." Mary nodded, though her throat felt tight. After lunch, Eleanor announced, "Mary will accompany me to the orchard." The words fell into the dining room like a stone into still water. Nathaniel's fork stopped. He lifted his gaze, just briefly, and Mary saw something in his eyes. Fear, perhaps, or the shadow of a conscience trying to wake up. Eleanor's voice remained bright. "It's such a lovely day," she added. "We should take advantage of it." Mary kept her eyes lowered. "Yes, Ma'am." They left the house together, Eleanor carrying her pale parasol like an emblem of her place in the world. The yard was full of small, ordinary movement. Someone carrying a basket, a dog trotting past, a stable boy leading a horse. Ordinary life pretending not to see the tension threading through the air. As they approached the orchard gate, Mary's heartbeat quickened. She forced herself to breathe slowly. She forced her face into neutrality. Eleanor opened the gate without waiting for Mary to do it. She stepped through first, and Mary followed 2 steps behind. The orchard smelled sweet and damp, a quiet place that seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor strolled as if she were on a promenade. She spoke casually about trees and fruit, as though conversation could erase what she had threatened. Mary answered with soft acknowledgments, careful not to reveal anything in her tone. They reached the pear tree. Eleanor tilted her head, admiring the low branch. "Those look ripe," she said, lifting her hand toward the fruit. Mary's mouth went dry. Eleanor stepped off the worn path, precisely as Mary had expected. Her shoe sank slightly into the softened soil. Then it happened. There was a sudden metallic snap, sharp, decisive, unmistakable. Eleanor's scream tore through the orchard. Mary froze so completely that for a heartbeat she could not feel her own limbs. The world narrowed to Eleanor on the ground, parasol thrown aside, her body jolted into shock. Eleanor clutched at her leg with frantic hands. Her face, usually so controlled, had collapsed into raw disbelief. She looked at Mary with eyes wide and burning. "You," she gasped, as if naming Mary could undo the pain. "You did this." Mary could not speak. Her throat had locked. Her mind was split between horror and a grim, cold certainty. This was the only way the world here ever acknowledged danger, by letting it bite. Eleanor screamed again, calling for help. Her voice carried beyond the fence. Within moments, people rushed into the orchard. Men from the yard. Ruth, pale and shaking. Jonah, his face drained of color. Miss Della, hovering at the edge as if afraid the ground itself might turn against them. Nathaniel arrived last. He ran, which Mary had never seen him do. He stopped short when he saw Eleanor, his expression changing as quickly as the sky before a storm. He dropped to his knees beside her, hands hovering as if he did not know where to touch without making things worse. Eleanor grabbed his sleeve with a grip that looked desperate. She said it. Eleanor cried. "She tried to kill me." Nathaniel's gaze flicked to Mary. Mary stood with her hands empty at her sides, her body rigid, her face too calm to be natural. She did not look at the trap. She did not look at Eleanor's injury. She looked at Nathaniel, because in this moment, he was the judge, whether he wanted to be or not. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Mary," he said, voice low. Mary's mouth finally opened. The words came out softer than she expected. "She said she would handle it," Mary whispered. A hush fell, thin and fragile, broken only by Eleanor's harsh breathing. Eleanor's face twisted with fury. "Liar," she hissed. "Witch." "Thief." Nathaniel stood, sudden and stiff, as if movement were easier than thinking. "Get her back to the house," he ordered. "Now." Men worked quickly, grimly. Someone brought cloth. Someone tried to lift Eleanor without jarring her. Eleanor's screams turned into tight, furious sobs. Her eyes never left Mary. As Eleanor was carried away, she shouted over her shoulder, voice ragged with pain and hatred. "Put her in the cellar. Put her where she belongs." The words struck the orchard like a whip. Mary felt the blood drain from her face. The cellar. Nathaniel stood still for a long moment, staring after Eleanor, as if a demand had dragged something out of him that he had hoped would stay buried. The workers looked at him, waiting. Mary waited too, her entire life balanced on the next breath he took. Nathaniel's gaze returned to her. For an instant, Mary saw it clearly. He understood. He understood what Eleanor had been doing. He understood that Mary had been trapped long before she placed iron in the soil. But understanding did not make him brave. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with the cold discipline of a man protecting his own order. "Take her," he said. Two overseers moved toward Mary and seized her arms. Their grip was firm, practiced. Mary did not struggle. Struggling would only turn the story against her more quickly. It would give them the satisfaction of calling her wild. As they dragged her from the orchard, Mary passed Jonah. Jonah's eyes met hers, and in them she saw grief, and something else, too. A warning. He did not speak. He could not. They pulled Mary across the yard. People stared from doorways. Some faces were blank. Some were frightened. Some held a fleeting, secret sympathy that could not be acted upon. The big house loomed ahead, white columns and shaded porch, beautiful in a way that felt cruel. Inside, the atmosphere had turned sharp with panic. Voices rose. Footsteps ran. Someone cried that the doctor had been sent for. Someone else insisted Eleanor needed more cloth, more water, more control. Mary was dragged to the hallway corner where the rug lay over the cellar door. The overseer kicked the rug aside. The wooden door appeared, worn and thick, iron hinges dark with age. Mary's heart slammed against her ribs. Nathaniel arrived in the hallway, his face pale, his eyes set. His clothing was immaculate, but his composure looked frayed at the edges, like a rope stretched too tight. Mary lifted her head. "You know what she's done," she said quietly. "You know what she planned." Nathaniel's lips pressed together. For a moment, he looked like a man who wanted to deny reality because admitting it would require action. "I know," he murmured. The admission startled Mary more than silence would have. "Then don't," Mary whispered. "Don't do this." Nathaniel's eyes flicked toward the staircase, as if he could already hear Eleanor's rage from upstairs. His jaw worked, his throat tightening. "What would you have me do?" he asked, low and harsh. "If I let you go, the house burns. If I punish you lightly, she will punish you worse. There is no good choice left." Mary stared at him. She understood then. He was not asking her. He was confessing to himself. "You're choosing her," Mary said softly. Nathaniel's face tightened as if struck. He looked away for half a second, just long enough to show he felt the truth of it. Then he looked back, and something shuddered behind his eyes. "I'm choosing order," he said, as if order were sacred. "And you broke it." Mary's hands trembled inside the overseer's grip. "She broke it first," Mary said. She just wore a smile while she did. Nathaniel's nostrils flared. For a brief moment, it looked like he might speak, might argue, might finally say her name and call her cruelty what it was. But the house above them echoed with Eleanor's cries and commands, and Nathaniel's courage, whatever small portion existed, folded in on itself. He nodded once at the overseers, a tiny gesture that sealed Mary's fate. "Open it," he said. One man knelt and fitted a key into the lock. The metal scraped. The padlock clicked. The chain shifted. From beneath the door came a sound, subtle, sliding, alive. Mary's stomach clenched. The door was lifted. Darkness breathed out, cool and damp, carrying the smell of wet stone and something older, something that did not belong in daylight. Mary stood on the edge and felt the air brush her skin like a warning. She heard it then, clearer than ever. The faint, slow whisper of movement below. Eleanor's voice drifted down the hallway from upstairs, sharp even through distance. "Is she gone yet?" She screamed. "Is she in the cellar?" Nathaniel's face hardened further, as if a voice pinned him in place. Mary looked at him one last time. She searched his expression for anything: mercy, regret strong enough to matter, courage. What she found was fear wearing the shape of authority. Her voice came out steady, despite everything. "You'll hear it," she said. "You'll hear it every night. The sound of what you did." Nathaniel flinched, just a fraction. Then the overseers pushed. Mary stumbled forward as the stairs dropped beneath her. She grabbed at the wall, fingers scraping damp stone. Her foot found the first step, then the next, forced downward by hands that refused to let her pause. The cellar swallowed light quickly. The open doorway above became a thin rectangle. Shadows gathered around Mary like water. She heard a soft hiss somewhere below, close enough that her skin prickled. Mary's breath caught, but she forced herself to keep moving, because stopping would mean falling, and falling would mean panic, and panic would mean death. Behind her, the door began to lower. The last thing Mary saw was Nathaniel Whitaker standing above, framed by the hallway's pale light, his face unreadable in the distance. For one heartbeat, his eyes met hers. Then the door shut. The lock clicked. And Mary was left with darkness, damp stone, and the quiet, sliding language of serpents waiting in the deep. Darkness down there was not empty. It had weight. It pressed against Mary's eyes and tongue and skin, filling her senses until she felt as if she had stepped into the inside of the earth. At first, she could still picture the hallway above, the pale rectangle of light, Nathaniel's distant face, the rug shoved aside like a careless secret exposed. But the image faded quickly, swallowed by the damp chill that rose from stone and soil. The door had closed, the lock had clicked, and the sound had been final in a way Mary had never heard before. Not like a bedroom door. Not like a pantry latch. Like a sentence. Mary stood on the top stair, one hand braced against the wall, forcing her lungs to draw slow, shallow breaths. Panic wanted to take her by the throat and shake her until she screamed, and she knew instinctively that screaming was the one thing she could not afford. She listened. A faint sliding sound traveled across the floor below. Something moved with no hurry. Something that did not fear being heard. Mary's fingers tightened against the stone. The wall was slick with moisture, cool enough to sting. She took one careful step down. Then another. She did not lift her feet, she slid them, testing each tread before trusting it. She had learned this kind of movement in the big house at night, when a wrong creak could summon Eleanor's attention. Here, a wrong step could summon something else. The staircase ended on uneven ground. The cellar was larger than she had imagined, Not a neat storage room, but a rough-cut chamber that sloped into deeper dark, as if the builders had dug until they reached something they did not want to disturb and then stopped. The smell was thick. Wet earth, old wood, mildew, and underneath it a living scent, musky, warm, animal. Mary kept her back near the wall and moved sideways, feeling for any ledge or raised surface. She wanted height. Height meant distance. Distance meant time. Something brushed her ankle. The touch was cool and quick, like damp rope sliding past. Mary's whole body locked. Her breath caught so hard it hurt. For a moment she could not move at all, because movement would become invitation. She waited, frozen, as the thing continued on its path, unhurried. The brush of it against her skin was not an attack. It was simply contact, the way a stranger might bump shoulders in a crowded street and never apologize. Mary swallowed, tasting metal in her mouth. She forced air back into her lungs and shifted her weight carefully, as if she were balancing on a narrow beam. Her eyes began to adjust. Not enough to see the room clearly, but enough to catch the idea of shapes. Thick shadows that were not stone, thin lines that moved when the rest of the dark stayed still. Occasional glints, eyes, perhaps, or moisture on scales, caught what little light leaked through cracks above. Mary found what she needed. A rough shelf of stone rising along one wall, waist-high, jagged and uneven. She climbed onto it slowly, knees trembling, and pressed her back to the damp rock. She drew her legs up, folding herself small, making as little heat and motion as possible. Below her, the cellar floor shifted. A long body, thick, heavy, moved along the wall with a slow authority that made Mary's stomach twist. A python, she thought. She had seen them once in a traveling show when she was younger. Huge, silent creatures that wrapped around a man's shoulders while a crowd pretended it wasn't afraid. The memory made her skin prickle. Down here, there was no crowd. No handler. No applause. A smaller hiss came from the darkness to her left. Mary tightened her arms around her knees and stared into blackness until her eyes ached. Time behaved differently down there. Without sun or clock, minutes stretched like cloth pulled thin. Mary counted her breaths to keep herself from slipping into panic. She listened to the room the way she had listened to Eleanor's voice in the sitting room, picking up what mattered beneath what was loud. She learned quickly that the cellar did not rest. It never became silent. It only changed rhythms. Sometimes the movement was slow and deep, the heavy drag of something large shifting position. Sometimes it was quick and nervous, the darting glide of smaller bodies weaving through shadows. Once, a shape rose briefly near the base of a ledge, its head lifted, tongue flicking. Mary did not move. The tongue tasted the air, tasting her. The head lowered again and slid away. Mary's throat tightened. She realized then that the cellar's cruelty was not simply the risk of being bitten or crushed. It was the constant awareness that she was being measured by creatures that did not care about her fear or her story. Creatures that only understood heat and movement and opportunity. Hours passed, she could only guess at hours, until she heard footsteps above. They were muted by wood and distance, but unmistakably human. A scrape. The low groan of hinges. A thin blade of light cut down into the cellar for an instant, pale and weak, but enough to sting Mary's eyes. Something slid across the floor, metal against stone. A bucket, then a lump of bread, tossed as if feeding an animal. No voice. No name called. No explanation. The light vanished. The door shut again. The lock clicked. Mary held herself still long after it closed. She watched the bread on the floor. She watched the bucket's surface catch faint reflections. She watched the snakes move, some drawn toward the new objects, others indifferent. Hunger tightened her belly like a knot, but she did not rush. She knew that hunger could make her careless, and carelessness would be punished faster than any overseer's whip. A smaller snake slid toward the bread first, investigating. It nudged the crust, tongue flicking. For a second, Mary's mind did something strange. She felt almost insulted that the snake could inspect her food as if it belonged to the cellar rather than to her. Then the snake lifted its head again and turned slightly, tasting the air. Mary understood. It wasn't interested in bread. It was interested in the warmth that came with movement. Mary waited until the snake drifted away. Then she descended from the ledge slowly, placing her feet carefully, keeping her arms close to her body. She moved like smoke, gliding rather than stepping. When something shifted near her left foot, she paused and let it pass. When a heavy body dragged across the ground ahead, she waited until it settled farther off. At last she reached the bucket. She crouched, keeping her face up and her limbs tucked. The water smelled like well water, not river. Mary dipped a finger, tasted cautiously. Clean enough. She drank in small sips, resisting the urge to gulp. Water could make her brave, and bravery was dangerous down there. She took the bread and retreated to her ledge, eating slowly in careful bites. Each swallow felt like a promise she was not ready to break. I will last. I will not die the way they want. When she finished, she pressed her forehead to the rock and closed her eyes. The first night was the hardest. Fear did not come as one wave, it came in cycles. Mary would feel calm for a few breaths, then suddenly her mind would flash images of coils tightening around her ribs, fangs sinking into her skin. She would stiffen, heart racing, then force herself back to stillness. Sleep, when it came, arrived in fragments. Mary dozed sitting upright, her head tipped against stone, and woke every time a body brushed the wall below or a hiss cut the air. Once, something touched her hand lightly, like a question, and she jerked back, stifling a cry against her sleeve. She learned quickly what the Whitakers truly meant by punishment. Not a swift end. A slow unraveling. Days passed. Or what felt like days. The rhythm became cruelly predictable. Bread and water at irregular intervals, sometimes twice in a day, sometimes not at all, as if someone above enjoyed watching her uncertainty stretch thin. Mary's skin remained damp from the cellar air. Her muscles ached from holding herself in the same cramped posture for hours. Her mind began to drift at the edges, trying to escape into memory. She remembered the attic, the poetry book hidden beneath the floorboard, the sunlit parlor where Eleanor's voice had sounded like honey over poison. She remembered Nathaniel's hand offering her paper as if paper could save anyone. And she remembered the orchard, the snap of iron, Eleanor's scream, the moment Mary had understood she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. At times, anger rose in her like heat. Not wild anger, but a steady burn that kept her from collapsing into despair. Eleanor had wanted her gone. Nathaniel had wanted order. The cellar was their compromise. Mary refused to become their lesson. She began to study the snakes the way she had studied the house. She watched their patterns. She noticed that the large ones tended to move along walls and corners, following roots like habits. The smaller ones were quicker, more unpredictable, and they reacted strongly to sudden movement or vibration. Mary learned to keep her heat contained, arms tucked, legs folded, so she would not be the most obvious warm shape in the room. She learned to move only when the cellar was quiet, only when the bodies had settled, only when she could see enough to judge distance. She learned, slowly, how to survive the Whitakers' private underworld. And then, on what might have been the third or fourth day, she heard it. A sound that did not belong to snakes. A human cough, faint and restrained, coming from deeper darkness beyond the slope. Mary froze, convinced at first that her mind had created it, an illusion born of loneliness. But the cough came again, followed by a shallow, controlled exhale, the kind a person makes when trying not to be heard. Mary's throat tightened so hard it hurt. She pressed her palm against the stone beside her and leaned forward slightly, listening. Silence. Then, very softly, another cough, quickly stifled. Mary's voice came out as a whisper so quiet it barely disturbed the air. Hello. No answer. She waited, heart pounding, afraid she had imagined everything. Then a voice, rough and exhausted, drifted through the dark. Don't move fast. The words hit Mary like light. Human words. Real. Mary swallowed. Who are you? She whispered back. A pause. Then, Thomas. Mary's eyes burned suddenly. She had not realized how much she needed a human voice until it arrived. How long have you been here? She asked. Thomas breathed out slowly. Long enough. Why? Mary whispered. A small, bitter laugh came from the darkness, careful not to be too loud. Same reason as you, Thomas said. Someone upstairs needed to make a point. Mary's fingers dug into the stone. I didn't steal, she whispered. Neither did I, Thomas replied. Not what they say, anyway. Mary hesitated. Names were dangerous, even down here. Yet the cellar already had her. It had her body, her fear, her time. It felt pointless to guard her name as if it could protect her now. Mary," she said softly. "Mary," Thomas repeated, as if tasting the sound. "Keep still. Keep your arms in. If you're on a ledge, stay there." "I found a ledge," Mary whispered. "Good," Thomas said. "Don't come looking for me." Mary's chest tightened. "Are you hurt?" Another pause. Thomas' voice lowered further. "Tired," he said. "Hungry. But alive." Mary closed her eyes, swallowing the sting behind them. "I thought I was alone." "No one's alone down here," Thomas murmured. "That's part of it. They want you to feel like you are." Mary let out a slow breath. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Who was he? How did he get here? Was there a way out? But she forced herself to be careful. Even whispers could carry. Even words could wake the wrong kind of attention. So she asked only what mattered most. "How do you live here?" Thomas' answer came in fragments, the way people speak when they have learned to conserve everything. Stillness. Patience. Don't run. Don't flail. When they bring bread, wait. When you drink, don't sprawl. If one comes close, don't slap at it. Mary nodded, though he could not see. "I've been trying," she whispered. "Keep trying," Thomas said. "The first days are when people die." Mary's stomach turned cold. She pressed her forehead to the stone again, as if the rock could hold her together. They spoke only occasionally after that, in short whispers during calm moments. Thomas did not offer comfort, and Mary did not ask for it. Comfort was rare, and expecting it was dangerous. What they offered each other instead was something steadier. Information, warning, proof of life. Thomas told her that the cellar had held snakes before Eleanor ever lived in the house, that it had been used as punishment by Nathaniel's father, and his father before him. A family tradition disguised as discipline. Thomas said he had once seen crates brought in at night, covered in burlap that moved. He said he had heard men above arguing about keeping them fed. Mary listened and felt something harden inside her. The cellar was not a moment of jealousy. It was a system. Knowing that did not free her, but it changed the shape of her fear. It made it less personal and more monstrous. It made her understand she was not singled out because she had made one mistake. She was simply caught in a machine that ran on cruelty. Above them, life continued. The house ate. The house slept. The house pretended. Mary imagined Eleanor in her bedroom, her injury wrapped, her anger burning. Mary imagined Nathaniel walking halls with guilt that would never become action. She imagined the cellar door hidden again beneath its rug, as if the wood could erase what lived below it. Mary did not know which was worse, the snakes, or the ease with which the world above could forget she existed. Then the air began to change. It happened gradually, over what Mary guessed was another day. The cellar grew heavier with moisture. The stone walls seemed to sweat. The smell of wet earth sharpened. Mary felt pressure in her ears, the way she had felt it before storms in the river country. Thomas whispered from the dark, weather's turning. Mary's throat tightened. "How do you know?" "You feel it," Thomas murmured. "And they feel it." Mary glanced down. The snakes were shifting more than usual. The smaller ones moved quickly, restless. The larger bodies relocated toward higher ground, as if the cellar itself warned them of what was coming. Mary pressed her back harder against the stone ledge, pulling her knees tight. She listened for footsteps above. She listened for any sign of change. Hours later, she heard the first distant roll of thunder, muffled but unmistakable, vibrating through wood and earth. The storm was coming. Mary's heart thudded. Storms could be death in the open fields, but storms could also be disruption. Storms broke routines. Storms forced doors to open. Storms made people panic. Mary did not let herself hope too much. Hope was what had brought her to the orchard. Still, as the thunder grew closer, as rain began to drum faintly above, Mary felt something she had not felt in the cellar since the lock clicked shut. Possibility. In the dark, she whispered, barely audible, "If anything changes," Thomas answered, his voice steady despite the exhaustion in it. "You move when you have to," he said. "And not before." Mary closed her eyes and listened as the storm's first true, its first real crack of thunder, rolled over the plantation like a giant hand striking a drum. Above, the world was about to shake. Below, snakes stirred, restless and alive. and Mary, perched on her ledge in the damp dark, held herself perfectly still, waiting for the moment when stillness would no longer be enough. The storm arrived like a verdict. Thunder did not simply roll above the plantation. It pressed down through wood and earth, vibrating the cellar stones as if the sky itself were striking the ground with a heavy fist. Rain followed in sheets, and Mary felt the change immediately. The air thickened, the walls slicked with fresh moisture, and the floor, already damp, began to darken as if the cellar were slowly drinking. She stayed on her ledge, arms locked around her knees, breathing as quietly as she could. Stillness had kept her alive. Stillness, patience, and a mind that refused to unravel. But storms made rules unstable. Below her, the snakes began to shift. Not in their usual slow patterns, not in the measured routes Mary had learned to anticipate. The smaller ones darted in quick, nervous lines, and the larger bodies relocated as if guided by an instinct older than fear. The cellar's slope became a moving river of coils and gliding shadows, all searching for higher ground. Mary listened for Thomas. When the thunder cracked again, the sound sharper, closer, she heard his voice in the darkness, thin but steady. "Water's coming." Mary swallowed. "How bad?" "Bad enough," Thomas whispered. "Feel climb." Mary's eyes tracked the faint movement near the base of her ledge. A snake's head lifted briefly, tongue flicking, tasting the air as if it could taste the storm. Mary kept her voice low. "Can you get higher?" A pause. Then Thomas. "Not much room where I am." Mary's stomach tightened. She pictured him deeper in the cellar, in the lowest part where damp collected first. "Is there a way out?" She whispered. Thomas breathed out slowly, as if measuring whether he could afford to say it. "There's a drain passage," he murmured. "Old brick culvert. Might lead toward the river. Sometimes they keep it blocked." Mary's heart lurched. "Where?" "Past the slope," Thomas said. "Far wall. You'd have to move." Mary looked down at the shifting floor and felt her throat tighten. Moving across that room now, while the snakes were restless, felt like walking through a field of knives in the dark. Thunder cracked again. The cellar ceiling trembled. A thin trickle of water ran down the wall beside Mary's shoulder, cold as river stones. Above, she heard something new. Human shouting. The sound was muffled by floors and distance, but unmistakable. Voices raised in panic. Doors slamming. Someone calling for lanterns. The plantation's rigid order was bending under the storm's weight. Mary pressed her palm against the ledge and leaned forward, listening harder. She caught a phrase, "cellar," and then another voice shouting, "snakes." Her blood cooled. If the cellar flooded, the snakes would seek the nearest dry place. That dry place was the house. Mary's breath came too fast. She forced it down. Panic, she reminded herself, would make her sloppy. Sloppy meant dead. Another thunderclap struck so close it felt like the world split. For a brief moment, light seeped through cracks in the cellar door above, thin, flickering, like lightning finding the edges of the wood. In that faint flash, Mary saw the room more clearly than she had since she arrived. Damp stone, scattered debris, and bodies, so many bodies, moving with liquid grace over the ground. The water reached the base of her ledge. It was only a shallow sheet at first, but it spread quickly, turning the cellar floor into a slick mirror that reflected nothing but darkness. Snakes moved through it without hesitation. The smaller ones seemed energized by it, weaving faster. The larger ones relocated with heavy certainty, claiming the higher corners. Mary realized then that her ledge was no longer safe. The water would rise. The snakes would climb. Stillness would stop working. She whispered, barely audible, "Thomas, if I move toward the drain, can you follow my voice?" Thomas' answer was immediate. "If you get there," he said. "If you don't fall." Mary's fingers tightened on the stone until her knuckles ached. She looked toward the direction Thomas had described, past the slope, toward the deeper part of the cellar. The darkness there seemed thicker, as if it held its own gravity. Above, the house shouted again. The sound of running feet crossed overhead. A heavy bang, something falling, perhaps, shuddered through the ceiling. Then, suddenly, the lock above scraped. Mary froze. For a heartbeat, she thought the storm was shaking the mechanism. But the sound came again, metal on metal, deliberate. A key turning. The cellar door shifted. A thin blade of lightning-lit hallway cut down into the darkness, bright enough to sting Mary's eyes. The door opened wider. Cold air poured in, sharp and clean compared to the cellar's damp breath. With it came the smell of wet wood, candle smoke, and mud tracked into the house. A lantern appeared in the gap, held low. Jonah's face hovered above it, lined, tense, and terrified. "Mary," he hissed. Mary's body reacted before her mind could argue. She slid off a ledge and stepped toward the stairs. Careful, careful, because the moment she moved, snakes responded. A small body darted across the path ahead. A larger coil shifted near the wall. Jonah lifted the lantern higher, angling the light down the steps. "Don't run," he snapped in a whisper. "Move slow." Mary climbed, one step at a time, keeping her arms tucked in. Water slid around her ankles. The cellar seemed suddenly alive with urgency, snakes moving toward the new air and light. "Why are you?" Mary began, but Jonah cut her off. "No talking," he said. "Just up." She reached the top step. Jonah grabbed her wrist and hauled her into the hallway with a strength that surprised her. The air above was warmer, chaotic, filled with shouted instructions and the drum of rain against the roof. Mary stumbled, blinking, as Jonah shoved a rough cloak at her. "Put it on," he said. "Cover your hair. Head down." Mary wrapped herself in the cloak, trembling. "They'll see me." "They are busy," Jonah growled. Storm broke the back gate. Water's coming under the kitchen door. And he glanced toward the cellar opening with naked fear. "And those things are climbing." As if to confirm it, a thick, dark body slid up the last cellar step, head lifting toward the hallway. Jonah's face tightened. He swung the lantern's metal handle toward the snake, not striking hard, but shooing it back with the confidence of someone who had done worse things to survive. The snake recoiled, then redirected, slipping along the edge of the open doorframe as if searching for another route. Mary's stomach turned. Jonah swore under his breath. "We can't keep this open," he muttered. "But we can't lock it with them pushing." Mary's eyes snapped toward the deeper darkness below. "Thomas," she blurted. Jonah stiffened. "Who?" "There's another person down there," Mary said, voice shaking. "Thomas. Hez alive." Jonah's gaze flicked toward the stairs, then toward the hallway beyond where frantic voices rose. "No," he said. "No time." Mary grabbed his sleeve. "You can't leave him." Jonah's jaw worked. He looked older in that moment, as if every hard decision of his life had returned to claim interest. "Mary," he whispered, low and fierce, "you don't understand what you're asking." "I do," Mary said, and surprised herself with how steady her voice sounded. "I understand exactly." Another crash sounded above, wood cracking under wind or water. Someone screamed from the far end of the hall. The house was tearing at its own seams. Jonah stared at Mary for a long second. Then he looked down into the cellar, lantern light trembling over wet stone and moving coils. His expression shifted, anger, fear, and something like resolve. "Fine," he breathed. "But you do what I say." Mary nodded once, hard. Jonah lowered the lantern slightly and leaned toward the cellar stairs. "Thomas," he hissed. No answer at first. Jonah's voice sharpened. "Thomas, if you can hear me, answer." A pause. Then, from below, faint and strained, "Here." Jonah's shoulders eased just a fraction. "Where are you?" he demanded. "Deep," Thomas replied. Slope side. Jonah looked at Mary. "You know the way." Mary swallowed. "He said there's a drain passage, brick culvert, far wall." Jonah's eyes widened. "That old thing," he murmured, as if cursing the Whitaker's habit of building secrets into the earth. He leaned down again. "Thomas, you moving?" "I can," Thomas said. "Slow." Jonah's voice turned commanding. "Move toward the stairs. Follow the light. Don't swing your arms." Mary crouched at the edge of the opening and called softly, "Thomas, listen to me. I'm here. Come up." The cellar answered with movement. Snakes shifted toward the light again, drawn by air and warmth. Jonah repositioned himself like a guard at a gate, lantern held as both guide and warning. Minutes stretched thin. Then a shadow emerged on the stairs, human, hunched, moving cautiously. Thomas climbed one step at a time, his breathing controlled, his hands kept tight to his body. His face was gaunt in the lantern glow, eyes sunken with exhaustion, but he was alive. Mary's chest tightened painfully with relief. As Thomas reached the top step, a smaller snake darted near his boot. Thomas froze instantly, perfectly still, as if he had learned the cellar's rules the hard way. The snake slid past, uninterested once the human stopped moving. Jonah grabbed Thomas' arm and yanked him into the hallway. Thomas stumbled, catching himself on the wall, swallowing hard. For a moment, the three of them stood there, wet cloaks, lantern light, thunder shaking the house, like survivors on the edge of a collapsing world. Then Eleanor's voice cut through the storm like a whip. "Where is she?" Eleanor screamed from upstairs. "Where is that girl?" Mary's blood iced over. Jonah cursed. "That's our cue." He pushed the cellar door down with a grimace, forcing it shut against the subtle pressure of bodies below. He jammed the lock as best he could, hands shaking. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be perfect. It needed to last long enough. "Back way," Jonah said, turning to Mary and Thomas. "Ditch line. Follow it to the river. Don't take the road. Don't take the yard." Thomas steadied himself, blinking. "You're coming." Jonah's face tightened. "I can't," he said. "Not yet. Thee'll notice. Thee'll hang questions around my neck before they hang a rope." Mary's throat tightened. "Thee'll blame you." "Thee'll blame whoever they can reach," Jonah said, voice hard. "And right now, that's not you if you move fast." Mary looked down the hall. The house was chaos, shadows running, lanterns swinging, water seeping in under doors. Somewhere, a dog barked frantically, then fell silent. Mary's mind flashed to Nathaniel, to his fear disguised as authority, to the moment he had watched her descend into darkness. She did not go looking for him now. She did not owe him a farewell. Jonah shoved the lantern into Thomas' hands. "Take it. Keep it low. If you see men, kill the light and drop." Thomas gripped the lantern like it was a lifeline. Mary pulled her cloak tighter and followed Jonah down a narrow service corridor toward the back of the house. The floors were slick with rain tracked in. The sound of the storm swallowed quieter footsteps if you walked with care. They reached the kitchen door. It burst inward on a gust of wind so strong it made the hinges groan. Rain sprayed across the threshold. Beyond, the yard looked like a trembling sheet of darkness cut by lightning. Jonah opened the door fully, then shoved Mary and Thomas out into the storm. "Go," he barked. "Now." Mary stepped into the rain, cold water instantly soaking her cloak. The wind hit her like a shove. She nearly lost her footing in the mud, but Thomas caught her elbow, steadying her without a word. They moved along the side of the smokehouse, then toward the ditch line Jonah had indicated. Lightning flashed, revealing the plantation in violent snapshots. Fences bending, trees thrashing, the big house looming like a white ghost. Somewhere near the front, people shouted again, panicked voices rising as something slithered where it shouldn't. Mary did not look back for long. They reached the ditch and followed it, crouched low, letting the storm cover their movement. Water ran through the channel fast, pulling leaves and debris toward the river. Thomas kept the lantern shielded beneath his cloak, using only brief flickers of light when the path turned uncertain. They passed the orchard. In a flash of lightning, Mary saw the pear tree, branches whipping in the wind, fruit dropping into mud. She saw the worn path where Eleanor had stepped. She saw the disturbed patch of ground where the trap had waited. For a moment, Mary felt a surge of something like grief, not for Eleanor, not even for the act itself, but for the fact that her life had been forced into choices like iron jaws. Then the darkness swallowed the orchard again, and Mary kept moving. At the river's edge, the world opened into a wide, wet expanse. The water was high, churning with storm runoff. The cypress lines swayed like a wall of shadow. Mary and Thomas stopped beneath the shelter of thick roots and breathing branches. They listened. Behind them, the plantation was a distant roar, wind, thunder, and human panic braided together. Ahead of them, the river breathed its own indifferent rhythm. Thomas leaned against a tree, chest rising and falling hard. "You saved me," he said, voice rough. Mary shook her head. "Jonah did," she replied. Thomas looked back toward the plantation, eyes narrowed. "You think he lives through this?" Mary stared into the storm. "Jonah knows how to survive," she said quietly. "Better than anyone." Thomas' gaze shifted to her. "Where will you go?" Mary looked at the river. She thought of Nathaniel's hymns and poems, words about deliverance that had felt like stories for other people. She thought of Eleanor's smile and the needle under her pillow. She thought of the cellar's darkness and the way the house above had continued eating while she fought to breathe. She also thought, briefly, of the kind moments that had tempted her. Water left near her hands, paper offered like kindness. A man's regretful eyes. Mary understood now what that had been. Not love, not rescue, not even hope worth trusting. It had been hunger for safety, dressed up as romance. She would not starve herself on it anymore. "I'll follow the river," Mary said. "Away." Thomas nodded slowly. "There are people," he murmured. "Marsh folk. Some free. Some hiding. If you can reach them, I will," Mary said, even though she did not know how. The words were not a plan. They were a vow. Thunder cracked again, and lightning turned the water white for a heartbeat. In that stark light, Mary saw her own hands, wet, trembling, real. Hands that had served tea. Hands that had set iron in soil. Hands that had climbed out of a cellar full of living knives. Thomas lifted the lantern. "We should move before daylight," he said. Mary nodded. They waded along the riverbank, keeping to shadow, letting the storm cover their tracks. The rain did not feel gentle, but it felt honest. It struck her face without pretending it was anything else. As they disappeared into the wet darkness, Mary did not pray for Nathaniel's courage. She did not wish for Eleanor's forgiveness. She did not ask the world to become fair. She asked only for one thing, quietly, fiercely, and with the full weight of her survival behind it. "Let me live." And as the river carried the storm's water south, and the plantation's lights flickered behind them like failing stars, Mary walked forward into the unknown, alive, unowned, and no longer waiting for anyone upstairs to handle her.